Good evening everyone, welcome to BAJIRAO IAS Academy, the Hindu News Analysis. Today is 29th July 2025 and today we have some very important topics for the discussion. So one by one we'll try to discuss all these topics in a very detailed and in-depth manner. So without any further delay, let's get into the discussion and let's understand these topics. And the first topic with which we're going to start the session is about an important article that has been given in the Hindu newspaper, right? So in fact, this is very important from General Studies paper 2 and paper 3 point of view, and to some extent paper 1 point of view as well, because urbanization is a very important topic, and every year you can expect at least one question on urbanization. And along with that, if you look at the syllabus, General Studies paper 3, climate change and associated issues; General Studies paper 2, poverty and vulnerable sections of the society. So this topic is India has the highest number of slum clusters in the flood prone areas. And in fact, India is a country with the largest number of slums in the world. However, what is more concerning is most of these slum clusters are developed in flood prone areas, further increasing the vulnerability of the poor sections of the society. So let's understand the context of the topic first. So recently a new study has been published by Nature Cities, and this particular study has revealed that India has world's highest number of slum dwellers. So we all knew what are the slums. Now slums are places where people who don't have basic amenities such as drinking water, sanitation, hygiene, electricity, basic housing, and most of the people who are migrant laborers from rural areas to the urban areas. So because of inadequate housing or basic housing facilities provided in the urban centers, these slums actually develop. However, what is concerning is that most of these slums are developed in the flood prone areas. Now if they are developed in flood prone areas, their vulnerability will further increases. So according to this particular study, over 158 million people are residing in the flood prone areas, particularly the Ganga Delta in northern part of India. So this is what this Nature Cities report has revealed so far. So however, the data has also been extracted from the satellite images and flood maps. So all these factors have been underscoring an urgent need for inclusive urban planning. Right, so emphasis should be on inclusive urban planning. Now what are the basic elements of the inclusive urban planning? Now in inclusive urban planning, there should be basic amenities such as basic housing, healthcare, education, sanitation and hygiene, sanitation plus hygiene, drinking water, and other basic amenities should be provided as part of inclusive urban planning. And the social security and social safety aspects of the poor people should also be clearly understood or recognized in inclusive urban planning. So inclusive urban planning essentially providing basic amenities and other basic infrastructure to the urban poor residents, right? So therefore it has been highlighting the need for inclusive urban planning, and climate resilient infrastructure should also be built. So when I say climate resilient infrastructure, in recent times urban centers are increasingly vulnerable to the floods. So not just floods, but they are also becoming vulnerable to the heat waves as well. So they are becoming vulnerable to heat waves because of a phenomenon called the urban heat island. So this is the major phenomenon that has been further worsening the heat wave condition or heat wave situation in these urban areas, and urban centers are also increasingly vulnerable to the floods. So therefore the solution is building a climate resilient infrastructure, particularly in the global south. So if we talk about the global south, the world is divided into global north and global south. So global north and global south is separated by a line called Brent line, right? So this Brent line separates the global north and the global south. And if we talk about the global south, so global south has been facing the common problems such as higher levels of poverty, underdevelopment, lack of basic infrastructure, higher levels of unemployment existing, lack of education, lack of healthcare, lack of social security, social safety nets, high prevalence of infant mortality rate, maternal mortality rates, and poor progress in terms of the inclusive development or achieving the sustainable development goals, and they are also increasingly vulnerable to the climate change, right? So these are the major characteristic features of the global south. So therefore there is a need for climate resilient infrastructure should be built in the global south, and along with that there should be a proper planning for inclusive urban planning. Both inclusive urban planning and climate resilient infrastructure are need of the hour in the global south, right? Because in the global south most of the poor people are affected by the rapid urbanization and rapid population growths as well, right? So I hope you have understood this context. Now let's understand some data with respect to the number of people who are living in these flood prone areas, particularly the slums, right? So if you carefully observe the global trend of number of people who are living in the slums, and particularly those slums are developed in the flood prone areas, so actually 2.3 billion people around the world, so they would face flood exposure, right? So they would face flood exposure almost every year they would experience the flood exposure. However, around 445 million people are living in previously flooded areas, so there is a possibility of chronic flooding in these areas as well, and this data has been revealed by Moody's report, right? So Moody's report has revealed this particular data. Now this is what is a global trend, right? So it is what has been happening at the global level, right? Because this is a global trend. So what is the trend in India? How many people are living in slums? So in India around 600 million people are exposed to the coastal flooding or inland flooding, right? So around 600 million people, either inland flooding or the coastal flooding, right? So this is primarily in the urban slum clusters and slum areas. Mostly the 600 million people are living in urban slum clusters or slum areas. Now what is slum? Now the understanding of what exactly constitutes a slum is very important, but here the problem is there is lack of understanding of what constitutes a slum, right? So it is very, very important that first of all we need to understand what exactly is a slum before taking up any initiative that aimed at preventing or reducing the number of people who are living in slums which are developed in the flood prone areas, because it significantly increases their vulnerability. Now if we talk about the Ganga River Delta, it has the highest concentration of the floodplain settlements, right? So Ganga River Delta alone has the highest concentration of the floodplain settlements because of the low-lying terrain, right? So this is an advantage. Because of this low-lying terrain, there is a highest concentration of the floodplain settlements in Ganga river delta. And apart from that, apart from low lying terrain in the Ganga river delta, the other major advantage is high population density in this area. So thereby it becomes a hot spot for the slum formation and slum development, right? So this is about the Ganga river delta and India's scenario. And the we have understood how many people are living in slums which are developed in the flood prone areas. So similar to India, there is a and the climate impacts on slum dwellers will also further increase. For instance, Bangladesh capital Dhaka. So a significant portion of slum dwellers reside in the flood prone areas, like how a significant portion of India's population live in the Ganga river delta, which is a flood prone area. Similarly, Bangladesh capital Dhaka, a significant portion of slum dwellers reside in flood prone areas. However, the problem, what exactly is the issue now? The issue is lack of data. So we don't have the data, and this has created critical data gaps in mapping the vulnerable communities. So once we have to, once uh, we map the vulnerable communities who are living in these flood-prone areas. So once we assess their conditions, we will be able to come up with appropriate policies. And these policies aimed at addressing the existing structural issues. Right? So therefore, household surveys could potentially bridge this gap, regularly conducting a household survey in the slum areas which are developed in the flood-prone areas, and also providing valuable insights into the living conditions of slum dwellers. So these are the some aspects that have to be focused upon. Now, first of all, we'll understand why slums form in urban floodplains. Right? So why slums develop in the floodplains? So one thing is that these floodplains of any river, they actually offer low cost land. So land cost is very less. So this is the first advantage, right? So when the migrant workers, they migrate from the rural areas to urban areas, so it will be very difficult for them to buy a land, to rent a house. So therefore what they do, so they go and settle in these floodplains. So thereby over a period of time, the slums will be developed in these uh, floodplains across the rivers, right? So this is the one reason which is a major factor for the development of slums in the urban areas, which is the low cost land available in the urban flood plains. The second most important factor is that many slum people, they settle near the urban centers because the rural people migrate to urban areas because of the rural distress, and it is one of the push factor of migration. So they settle in urban centers to access jobs, right? So to access jobs, they settle in urban areas. They migrate from the rural areas and they come and settle in these urban centers to access jobs, right? So most of them settle in flood plains because a low cost land, first factor. Second factor, they would have access to the jobs. And third factor, they no need to live in highly costly urban rental rooms or houses. So therefore they settle in these floodplains despite natural disasters like floods. Thereby, it has been highlighting a link between urban poverty and climate vulnerability. Urban poverty plus climate vulnerability, right? So how there is a link between urban poverty and climate vulnerability? Let's understand this, right? So most of the people who settle in slums at floodplains, they are poor. They are migrant workers. They're looking for jobs. Since they are poor, they are settling in these floodplains. So when they settle in floodplains, they are vulnerable to frequent floods. They are vulnerable to frequent floods. Now, frequent floods very often leads to these people remain in chronic cycle of poverty, right? So therefore, the construction workers, the best example would be the construction workers. So they often live in the slum areas. However, builders avoid the flood-prone areas for high-end development, leaving these zones open to unregulated habitation and slum settlements as well. Right? So whenever the builders have been constructing new buildings, so they often leave flood-prone areas. Right? So when they leave the flood-prone areas, they leave these zones open to the unregulated habitation or settlements. So another major problem is lack of housing, right? So lack of affordable housing is also another major problem that very often the migrant laborers or urban poor face. Right? So in India, we don't have the affordable housing policies that can incentivize the migrant or poor laborers, right? So since we don't have the affordable housing policies, this leads to the marginalized populations into the vulnerable geographies. So what are the vulnerable geographies? Here, the floodplains are vulnerable geographies. Now, when they move inside these floodplains, when they have settlements in the floodplains, what happens? And it leads to climate vulnerability of the poor people. Right? So it leads to the climate vulnerability. And the quality of life or the living standards would be further degenerated or degraded, right? So apart from that, there existing the social and financial constraints. So what social and financial constraints are existing? Yes, of course, it is true that most of the people who are living in slums which are developed in the floodplain areas are poor, so therefore they have the financial constraints to have basic housing in the urban areas. And apart from that, they are also lacking insurance, and they lack access to education, they lack access to healthcare. So therefore all these factors would further increase their vulnerability to the urban floods. It further increases their vulnerability to the urban floods, because urban floods also leads to loss of life, loss of property, loss of life and loss of property. And all these factors will keep them in poverty cycle, and they would remain poor, and their living standards will not improve. They may not be able to achieve any progress in terms of their living standards as well. So I hope you have understood the factor. Now, what are the structural and policy failures that we must look into and focus on? Because there are existing some structural and policy failures as well. So one policy failure is lack of flood risk management strategies. Right? So it is a reality that the urban centers are increasingly vulnerable to the floods. So therefore, we don't have the flood risk management strategies. So even if we have the flood risk management strategies, so they ignore the informal settlements. What are these informal settlements? These are the settlements which are located in the floodplains in the urban areas. right? So they just focus on the strategies, the flood risk management strategies, focusing on the population level solutions only. So they just focus on population level solutions only instead of addressing the specific needs of slum communities. So what we have to do, we need to have the flood risk management strategies, and the flood risk management strategies should focus on informal settlements. The second factor is, in urban centers, we have, extensive drainage networks or drainage systems. And the problem is that poor management, poor management and maintenance of the drainage system. So that very often trigger the urban floods. That could very often trigger the urban floods during the torrential or heavy rainfall in urban centers like Delhi and other cities. And apart from that, the unplanned urbanization is also a major cause of concern. Unplanned urbanization. This is also a major problem that Indian urban centers have been facing. And the urban local bodies also failed to provide basic civic services. Now, all these three factors that we have just discussed, so they would make the flood prone areas more and more dangerous for the slum dwellers, right? So, coupled with that, lack of basic infrastructure, lack of basic infrastructure, this could further exacerbate the existing issues for the urban slum dwellers in the flood prone areas. Now, what is the problem? Poor management and maintenance of the drainage system in urban areas, firstly. Secondly, unplanned urbanization, and urban local bodies fail to provide basic civic services to the people who are living in the flood prone areas. And apart from that, so we have been following the top down disaster response instead of following a grassroots or a decentralized disaster response. We have been following a top down disaster response, and this top down disaster response lacks community engagement. This is the major problem. So it has been lacking the community engagement, right? So it is even lacking localized planning. Localized planning and community engagement is lacking. So that is the major problem here. If we follow the top-down approach with respect to disaster response. So however, here the top-down approach actually fails to consider the coping mechanisms. The coping mechanisms specifically developed for the slum dwellers so that their vulnerability can be substantially reduced. So the approach should be decentralized. It should take into account community engagement. They should be focused on localized planning as well with respect to the disaster response. So an example has also been given, right? So example is a city like Bangalore. There are informal settlements. These informal settlements in cities like Bengaluru are more flood vulnerable due to being excluded from the gated infrastructure development. So, therefore, it highlights a systematic urban inequality which has been existing. So, therefore, the urban poor who are vulnerable to the floods in urban areas. So, therefore, there is a need for basic infrastructure that has to be provided. Basic infrastructure needs to be provided in these urban centers, right? So, therefore, another major problem is lack of adequate data. Lack of adequate data about the number of households who are living in the floodplains or flood prone areas. So if we have data, so we can assess the vulnerability. We can assess the vulnerability. We can frame the appropriate policies and other measures to reduce vulnerability of people who are living in the urban slums. right? So therefore, we don't have adequate data to understand and manage the flood risk at the community level, especially in informal areas and other slums. However, this gap could be addressed by a comprehensive household surveys. They have to be conducted. However, what policy recommendations that we can actually suggest to reduce the vulnerability of people who are living in flood prone areas or floodplains in urban centers, right? So the policy recommendations include, so we should include slum dwellers in decision making, and that is very important. We should include the slum dwellers in decision making. So we should not follow the top down approach when it comes to the disaster response. Rather, we should focus on localized planning, right? So the emphasis should be on the localized planning. And apart from that, we should also include the slum dwellers in planning, to execution of resilience measures, development of basic infrastructure, basic necessity. So thereby, ultimately, we need to promote the community engagement or community participation. So that is how we can reduce the vulnerability of the slum dwellers to the urban floods. And apart from that, we should support the formation and empowerment of slum dwellers association. Slum dwellers association. So this is how we can empower the slum dwellers in India, particularly those people who are, those slums which are developed in the flood plains. So apart from that, we need to develop the ward level flood action plans and further ensure the localized adaptation for informal settlements in the slum areas, right? So we should also focus on community training in waste management, because the urban waste management would ensure that the urban, drainage system is not clogged, and this will also prevent the urban floods as well. And in order to improve the living standards in urban areas, we should also focus on sanitation and the drainage maintenance, so that we can actually build resilient urban communities to the urban floods. And we need to build the local capacities among the slum people. So that is how we can substantially reduce the vulnerability of people to the urban floods. And another major factor is affordable housing. Affordable housing is another major policy that needs to be looked into, right? So when we provide affordable housing for the urban slum dwellers, their vulnerability to the urban floods can be substantially reduced. However, an affordable housing can be taken up through the public-private partnership models and urban land reforms. So they can also address the slum formation in urban centers. And apart from that, we need to implement zoning regulation and building codes to ensure safe construction practices and also improving the housing quality in urban centers. Similarly, we need to align development with disaster risk reduction measures, building climate resilient infrastructure and climate mitigation. Social equity goals needs to be achieved to further enhance the resilience of urban slum dwellers and other vulnerable communities to weather events or the climate change driven disasters. So ultimately, we need to implement policies to provide slum dwellers with secure tenure and land rights. Right? So there should be secure tenure. Along with secure tenure, there is a need for land rights as well to reduce the vulnerability to forced evictions and improving the long-term sustainability as well. Right? So The next important topic is 5 years of national education policy. Let's understand about the national education policy, and this could be important for the general studies paper too, right? Particularly social justice. So this national education policy is important. So let's understand the context. So the context is that the national education policy was framed in the year 2020. We all knew about this, right? So it was framed in the year 2020, and it is also known as new education policy. So, this new education policy marks 5 years since its launch, right? So therefore, it's time to assess the implementation of the national education policy 2020, right? So this national education policy came up with several reforms. So what such reforms it has, come up with? For example, it has brought in the curriculum changes, credit systems has been introduced, and early childhood education have initiatives have been launched. However, many such reforms which are proposed by the national education policy are being stalled. So why they are stalled? Why they are blocked? Because of the center state friction which has been existing, the regulatory delays which are required to be implemented, and resistance from the institutions and the state government. So these are the major hindrance for the implementation of the reform suggested by the National Education Policy of 2020, despite it has introduced several reforms, right? So now let's understand what has been successfully implemented as part of the National Education Policy of 2020. Now, if you carefully look into it, the 10 plus 2 structure has been replaced with 5 plus 3 plus 3 plus 4 system, right? So, as of now, the 10 plus 2 structure has been existing, but the National Education Policy has suggested 5 plus 3 plus 3 plus 4 system has been suggested. And this system, ranges from foundational to the secondary levels. And apart from that, NCERT has also rolled out new textbooks for the classes 1st to 8th class for the combined subjects like social science for the integrated learning of the students. And it has also successfully implemented the academic bank of credits and national credit framework to promote the flexibility in learning paths of the students, right? So it has even introduced the common university entrance test that has been launched in the year 2022, and it offers a single window college entry mechanism. And similarly, international campuses of Indian institutes were also opened, such as IIT Madras in Zanzibar, IIM Ahmedabad in Dubai. So therefore, it signals a global outreach of Indian educational system as well, right? So you can also go through the highlights of the national education policy or new educational policy. So it talks about universalization of early childhood care and education, national mission on foundational literacy and numeracy has been launched, and a curricular and pedagogical structure has been introduced, which is called as 5 plus 3 plus 3 plus 4 system, right? So a curriculum has been introduced to integrate 21st century skills, mathematical thinking, scientific temper into the learning process, and no rigid separation between art and science, between curricular and extracurricular activities, between occasional and academic streams. And apart from that, integration education of gifted children, gender inclusion fund has been launched, and Kasturba Gandhi Balika Vidyalayas uh, will be providing education up to grade 12, and reduction in the curriculum to core concepts and vocational integration from class 6 onwards. So these are the major highlights of the new education policy of 2020. So let's understand the historical context and vision of new education policy of 2020. What are the major reforms that it has introduced? Now, India follows a colonial education system, right? So the colonial education system mostly focuses on producing clerks, and it lacks creativity and innovation. And for any aspiring nation, creativity and innovation in education system is very, very important. So therefore, The new education policy of 2020 mostly focuses on creativity and innovation firstly. So secondly, after India's independence, certain reforms were brought in into the education system. But the problem is that these reforms fail to restructure the outdated education system, which mostly focuses on producing clerks, which lacks creativity and innovation. However, the new education policy of 2020 that aimed at aligning Indian education system with the 21st century needs, right? So, first of all, we need to understand the 21st century needs. So therefore, the new education policy has aligned Indian education system with 21st century needs and the global standards as well. And apart from that, emphasis has been placed on skill development, value-based learning, and the technology integration as well. Now, skill development is very important because just 4.5 percentage of India's population are formally skilled. For example, in China, 45 percentage of its workforce formally skilled. In Japan, 85 percentage of its workforce formally skilled, and in South Korea, around 95 percentage of its workforce are formally skilled. So therefore, India has a huge demographic dividend. A skilling existing India's demographic dividend is very important to achieve the goal of becoming Vikasit Bharat, becoming Vikasit Bharat by the year 2047. And apart from that, value-based learning should be emphasized instead of the rote learning. Instead of rote learning, we should focus on the value-based learning, and technology integration should also be adequately focused on, right? So therefore, we need to promote inclusive education. We need to bridge gender, regional, and economic disparities in the education system, right? So if we talk about the school education reforms, so it has introduced 5 plus 3 plus 3 plus 4 curricular structure. And this curricular structure focuses on foundational to the secondary stages of education. So we have already understood this. And early childhood initiatives were also introduced, such as Bal Vatika, Vidya Pravesh, and Jadui Pithara. So all these factors are the early childhood initiatives that have been introduced as part of the new education policy of 2020. And apart from that, the curriculum also updated with artificial intelligence, design thinking, and data sciences as well. So remember that the national education policy is aimed to align Indian education system with the 21st century. So therefore, the curriculum needs to be updated with the latest and emerging technologies such as artificial intelligence, design thinking, and the data sciences as well. So therefore, what are the reforms which are in progress and why these reforms are in partial implementation or not fully implemented? So firstly, 4-year UG degrees. Now the undergraduation degrees which are actually made 4 years, and they also have the multiple entry and exit options have started in central universities. However, others face faculty and infrastructure issues. So therefore, this is the first major problem. The second second thing is that mother tongue has also been introduced as a medium of instruction till class 5, right? So CBSE schools have initiated it up to class 2nd. But National Education Policy has suggested that mother tongue instruction should be made mandatory till class 5. And apart from that, the Jadu Pitara kits and national, ECCE curriculum support, which is early childhood care and education goals, right? So there should be early childhood care and education curriculum support and Jadu Pitara kits. So these things have also been introduced as part of the new education policy. And similarly, there will be holistic report cards as well, which are developed by Parak to exist in the concept but lack implementation in most boards. States like Delhi, Karnataka, Kerala, so they now enforce minimum age of 6 years for class 1, thereby affecting the enrollment of the children, right? So therefore, Reforms which have been facing roadblocks in the implementation of a new education policy. So a three-language formula. So this three-language formula remains contentious because some states like Tamil Nadu strongly oppose this three-language formula, and they also see a three-language formula suggested by the new education policy as a step towards Hindi imposition on the southern states, firstly. Secondly, teacher education reforms like four-year integrated BED course, so it lacks the regulatory clarity and acceptance from the older program. So this is the second major issue that the reform has been facing. The third major reforms which have been suggested by the new education policy, they just remain on the paper, and it is being slowed by the institutional delays and even the resistance from the structural changes, right? So that's all, and I hope you have understood that particular topic as well. So next important topic is presidential reference has been challenged by the southern states. So let's understand what exactly is a presidential reference and why it has been challenged by the southern states. Now it is with respect to governor giving assent to the bills. Now let's understand the context. So first, this topic has been given in the Hindu newspaper, right? So this has been given in the Hindu newspaper, and this could be important for prelims and mains examination, particularly General Studies paper 2 in mains examination. This would be important, right? So what is the context? So if I can tell you, Tamil Nadu State Legislative Assembly passed a number of bills, but once a bill is passed, a bill to become a legislation, it has to be given assent by the president. The president must give, the governor of the state must give assent to the bills. Only then the bills will become acts. But Tamil Nadu Governor R.N. Ravi is not giving assent to the bills, right? So whatever bills that the Tamil Nadu State Legislative Assembly has been passed, Tamil Nadu Governor R.N. Ravi is not giving assent to the bills, right? Some bills he's returning for the reconsideration of the state legislative assemblies. Some bills he's reserving for the consent, reserved for the president for his assent, and some bills he's not at all giving assent. So because of this reason, Tamil Nadu state government approached the Supreme Court, saying that governor is not giving assent to the bills. Now, in this case, the Supreme Court has held that governor must give assent to the bills passed by the state legislative assembly, because the state legislative assembly's will prevails, because the state legislative assembly is directly elected by the people. However, governor is not directly elected by the people, even though he is a constitutional head. So therefore, Supreme Court made it clear that governor must give his assent to the bills within 3 months. He must give assent to the bills within 3 months. However, Constitution Article 200 is silent on this, right? So there is no time frame fixed by the Constitution. There is no time frame fixed by the Constitution to give assent to the bills passed by the state legislative assembly, either to the president or to the governor. And because of this reason, there is a delay in giving assent to the bills passed by the state legislative assembly, particularly the opposition ruled the state legislative assemblies. So since Constitution has been silent, the Supreme Court said that the governor must give his assent to the bills within 3 months. This is not just applicable for the governor, but it is also applicable for the president as well, right? So this is the background. Now, whenever any bill is passed by the state legislative assembly, under Article 200 of the Indian Constitution, the governor would have the following options. So one is he may give his assent to the bills. Second, he may withhold his assent to the bills, right, which is called as pocket veto. Third, he may send the bill to the reconsideration of the state legislative assembly. So in this case, if state legislative assembly passes this bill again and send this bill to the governor, it is mandatory on the part of the governor to give his assent. So the fourth option is reserving the bills for the president. Right, so he would have the four options under Article 200. However, Article 200 has not mentioned any time frame within which the governor must give his assent. Right, so I hope you have understood this context. Now, Tamil Nadu and Kerala, they have opposed the presidential reference. Now, after the Supreme Court has said that the governor must give his assent to the 3 months, then it leads to the judiciary's interference into the executive domain judiciary's interference into the executive domain. So after this judgment of the Supreme Court, the president has sought the presidential reference to the Supreme Court, whether the Supreme Court can give such directions to the executive, such as governor and the president, to give assent to the bills passed by the assemblies within 3 months. So, which is called as presidential reference, right? However, recently Tamil Nadu and Kerala state governments, they have opposed the presidential reference in the Supreme Court, and both states have been arguing that the presidential reference seeks to review an already settled judgment, a judgment which is already settled regarding the powers of the governor. So, Article 200 and 201 of the Indian Constitution, they calling the reference misleading and unconstitutional. So, therefore, it has raised certain challenges, certain issues, and significant constitutional questions and other implications in the federal principles of or in India. Next, Tamil Nadu and Kerala, so they are representing the state governments, right? And they urged the Supreme Court to dismiss the presidential reference, calling it an appeal in disguise. And it is also a potential misuse of the constitutional powers as well. So therefore, the state has said that president cannot refer. Both Tamil Nadu and Kerala, they have mentioned that president cannot refer settled questions of law under Article 143. So this presidential reference has been sought under Article 143 of the Indian Constitution. So thereby it has been emphasizing on the importance of respecting the judicial precedents, right? So therefore, the Kerala state government even argued that Supreme Court cannot sit in appeal of its own judgments, thereby highlighting the principle of judicial finality. So whatever judiciary has said, it is final. So there should not be any judicial reference on this matter. And in fact, both Tamil Nadu and Kerala, they even claimed that center's reference was an attempt to bypass legal procedures like review or curative petitions. So they have established methods for challenging the Supreme Court judgments. However, the judicial reference by the presidential reference was also termed misleading by these states based on the suppressed facts and raising concerns about the proper use of the constitutional authority as well. Right? So, these states have mentioned that the whatever the judiciary has said with respect to governors and president giving assent to the bills would be final, and such a presidential reference is not required, right? So in this case, the Tamil Nadu governor judgment, which is now subjected to the constitutional interpretation debate, so it was authored by Justice J.B. Padiwala, and it is a five-judge bench of the Supreme Court, which is also called as the Constitutional Bench. However, the Kerala has argued that since no review petition or other form of appellate jurisdiction was exercised on this, the judgment attained the finality in accordance with the constitutional law, so which is final. However, the Union government did not challenge the verdict through valid means such as writ petition or other procedural mechanisms. So therefore, seeking the presidential reference of the judgment by the President of India under Article 143 of the Indian Constitution is legally untenable, and it should not be used to reopen already settled matters, because it will undermine the principle of res integra in the constitutional issues. This is what both Tamil Nadu and Kerala have said, right? So therefore, both these states have emphasized judicial pronouncement must be respected to uphold the constitutional principles and the constitutional oath taken by all parties involved. Now, if we talk about Article 143 of the Indian Constitution, so Article 143 of the Indian Constitution, it empowers the President to seek an advisory opinion from the Supreme Court on certain legal questions, and the presidential reference has been made under Article 143 about the Supreme Court issuing directions to the Executive Governor and President to give assent to the bills within 3 months. However, this can only be invoked if the question has not already been decided by the court, respecting the principle of judicial adjudication. So if judiciary has not heard this matter, not settled this matter, only then this presidential reference must be used. However, as per Article 141 of the Indian Constitution, Supreme Court rulings are binding on all courts and all authorities, thereby serving as an authoritarian pronouncements on legal matters. The April 8 Tamil Nadu Governor case judgment has already settled the issue, making it as part of settled constitutional laws.